Welcome to our next topic in anatomy and physiology, the nervous system. As you may recollect, nerve tissue is one of the four basic tissues of the body, and the nervous system is certainly one of the most complex and interesting. In this unit, we'll get to explore not only the biology of the system, but the chemistry of the neurotransmitters, the physics of electrical transmission, as well as the mechanics of perception and response that informs our psychological state. Hopefully, it'll inspire you, your interests, and provide some insights into the nature of consciousness and the philosophical discipline of mind-body dualism. Remember what Rene Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. So let's begin. So when we look at nerve tissue, we identify two basic cell types, neurons and the neuroglial cells. The neurons actually transmit electrical and chemical information, and the neuroglial cells are support cells, all right? So they support the neurons. The nerve tissue, the brain itself takes up about 30% of your blood glucose on a daily basis. And here we see a typical axon. It's easy to identify because of all these cellular processes, all right, these extensions of the cytoplasm. There's really two types of processes. The dendrites, which take information into the neuron, and then there is typically one axon in the cells that we're going to look at, and the axon actually transmits the action potential or the electrical impulse away from the neuron. So here's the cell body or soma. Here's the nucleus. This region here, so this is the axon of this neuron, as I believe. This region here is very important. It's called the axon hillock, a little hill, right? And then out here you can see the nuclei of multiple cells, and they represent the neuroglial cells. And there's 5 or 6 different types of neuroglia, and we'll see what their roles are. When we talk about the nervous system, we talk about its divisions and organization, right? So the central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is made up of the peripheral nerves. At the top, we have cranial nerves, and then as we descend down the spinal column through the vertebra, we have these nerves that project out that make up spinal nerves. The peripheral nervous system, so we're going to spend a lot of time with the central nervous system, but the peripheral nervous system is further subdivided into the sensory division, which pick up sensory information and bring it to the brain, and the motor division. And the motor division carries information to muscles and glands, which is further divided. So the motor division is divided into the somatic, which carries information to skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic, which carries information to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and the glands. All right, so that's the involuntary aspect of the motor division. Guess what? The autonomic division is further subdivided into what we call the parasympathetic and the sympathetic division. Right. So here we go. Central nervous system takes information via the motor system to the somatic, which I can move skeletal muscles, work the autonomic, right? So the autonomic has parasympathetic and the sympathetic divisions, and they sort of have a couple different effects. The sympathetic generally excites, and the parasympathetic generally inhibits, but it depends on which tissue you're talking about. On the other hand, I have sensory receptors, right? I have feelings, I have sensory receptors in the skeletal muscle. I have special sensory receptors in my, optic system and auditory system. And then I also have sensory receptors in the organs. And this information is taken back to the central nervous system via the peripheral nerves, and then finally to the central nervous system. Here's a couple words here: the afferent and efferent, right? Affect, right? You're affected by something, right? But you can create an effect by action, okay? So in general, we say that the efferent division, the peripheral nerves, are descending, right? Coming from the central nervous system out to the periphery. And then we have afferent projections from the periphery to the central nervous system. And we'll see afferent and efferent pathways in the spinal column later in our discussion. So again, when we talk about the nervous system function generally, we talk about this black box where information comes in, it's processed, and then it comes out. And we, again, divide that on the basis of motor function and sensory function, and then this integrative function, right? So the black box is where we sort of process that information, right? So I take receptive information through the sensory system, carry to the central nervous system, and that's where things are integrated. That's where things are processed, and really what we do is we create a mental model of the world, and then we can make decisions and actions based on what's necessary. So again, here's sort of a diagrammatical representation of the axon, of the neuron. Remember that here's the cell body. It's got all the apparatuses you would expect with a normal cell, right? We have the axon, and in this case, we're showing a sort of what we call a multipolar cell, right? So it has one axon that projects on some target. Now, the target we just saw in the last unit was muscle tissue, but here in this diagram, we're going to affect another neuron nearby. In fact, it can affect lots of neurons with that axon. So remember, the axon carries information away from the cell in the form of an electrical impulse called the action potential, and then at the terminus, right, at the terminal bouton, that electrical information, that impulse is turned into a chemical message, right, through neurotransmitters. We talked about acetylcholine in our last unit as well. On the other hand, I have these dendritic processes, as many as 10,000 dendrites for a neuron. And of course, they're being affected by other external stimuli, right? Other neurons can synapse on these dendrites and excite or inhibit them. Since this is an electrical message being sent down the axon, one of the things that we have is a tissue called myelin. All right, now myelin arises from the neuroglia. Myelin is an insulator. It's an insulator that helps minimize the degradation of that electrical impulse. It also speeds up the transmission, and so axons can be wrapped by myelin, and myelin is, in part why nerve tissue appears white. In fact, when we look at nerve tissue in the brain and central nervous system, we can identify gray matter and white matter. And the gray matter is made up of the cell bodies, and the white matter is made up of myelinated neurons, or those Schwann cells. Now, Schwann cells, we're going to talk about Schwann cells. It's one of the glial cells. And there's another cell associated with making myelin. Note that the myelin isn't complete, that the individual Schwann cells make up these sort of segments, and the in between each of these segments are these little exposed regions of the axon called the nodes of Ranvier. And they're important in allowing the electrical potential to actually jump from one node to the next, kind of like spark on a spark plug. So again, the white matter contains myelinated axons, and you can see here, I don't just necessarily have to have a Schwann cell or myelin that wraps around one axon, but I can have multiple axons that are sort of included in that one myelin cell. What else? Well, you see this wrapping here. You're going to see this lamellar structure, these layered structures over and over again, and again, axon, myelin, node of Ranvier. Remember that there's multiple types of neurons, and the ones we're going to be most familiar with is this sort of typical multipolar neuron, right? Where I have multiple dendrites and typically one axon. Um, there are a couple of multipolar cell types, the pyramidal cells and the Purkinje cells, and these guys are sort of like have a specific distribution. So the pyramidal cells are important in the visual cortex, and the Purkinje cells are found, as I recollect, in the cerebellum. Right? These guys are really small. On the other hand, I can have bipolar and pseudo-bipolar cells. All right, and so these guys have a cell body that's contiguous with, and then this cell body does some different stuff. Not super important. We're gonna focus on the multipolar neuron generally, but just realize that there's other ways for you to build a neuron. So again, we go to this idea of the input black box output, right? So I have sensory neurons that carry information up, afferent. This creates your affect. They carry information to the central nervous system. Most of them are unipolar, some are bipolar, right? So we'll look at some specific sensory neurons and sensory receptor cells, and then finally those peripheral nerves. In the brain and the central nervous system, we have a variety of different cell types and interconnections, right? We call these interneurons. And then last but not least, those central nervous system neurons are connected to motor neurons that carry impulses away from the central nervous system, and we, via efferent pathways, right? They're able to affect tissues. So the neuroglia are really interesting. So remember we talked about the Schwann cells, right? Well, the Schwann cells are found in the nerves of the periphery, all right? They're myelinating cells. And they have a counterpart in the central nervous system called oligodendrocytes, all right? So Schwann is outside, oligodendrocytes is inside. I don't know, this is a really complicated word. Your brain's a really complicated place, all right? Maybe that'll be, I don't know, come up with a mnemonic to remember these two, right? So anyway, Schwann's in the periphery, oligodendrocytes are in the central nervous system, and then we have cells called the microglia, and they are phagocytic cells. In fact, they constitute the immune system for the brain. Now, the central nervous system, is what we call immune privileged. That sounds like a good thing, and it is. It has its own little army of the microglia, but the brain is protected by a very finely meshed network of capillaries that really resist the entry into the brain of almost everything. Right? Nothing's allowed to get into the brain. It's all filtered through the blood-brain barrier, this layer of capillaries. And so big cells like the phagocytic cells that are the normal part of your innate immune system can't get into the brain, so they have their own. Well, that's good and that's bad, because if something gets into the brain, then it can be overtaxed relatively easily, I guess. And of course, you end up with encephalitis, right? Swelling of the brain, which is always double plus on good. The astrocytes are those cells that actually support specifically the neurons, right? So they connect neurons to blood vessels, and they are responsible for bringing glucose in and taking out waste. Last but not least, and they're astrocytes because they're star-shaped cells. And they can also create scar tissue, and we'll talk maybe about strokes with respect to astrocytes later. Last but not least are the impedima, right? The impedima secrete cerebrospinal fluid, all right? These cells are ciliated. They line the central canal of the spinal cord and these big cavities in the brain we call ventricles, all right? So cerebral spinal fluid sort of helps support the brain, and we'll talk about the role of cerebral spinal fluid in our upcoming lectures on meningitis. And so here's a nice diagram of these different things. Remember, oligodendrocytes, this is obviously a central nervous system here, right? These would be interneurons. Here's this astrocyte that's taken nutrition from the blood vessels. And I don't know, where's the microglia? Here they are, running around looking for trouble. Well, our next topic is going to be electrophysiology, and I will see you then. Have a great day.